In this video, we're doing a writing tip extravaganza. We're talking about 26 of my favorite tips that I've learned over the years for writing engaging characters. What's up, guys? Michael Aron with Author Level Up here, helping you write world-class stories better and faster. And I create these videos because I believe that each of you has Stephen King level talent and you just need help unlocking it. So if you're new here, consider subscribing and click that little bell, ding, 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 to get writing notifications or video notifications every time I have a new video. This video is part of my How to Write Engaging Main Characters series, where I delve into character tips to help you write characters that your readers will never forget. And so we're talking about 26 of my favorite tips. Let's get into it. Tip number one is to consider casting your characters. So have a actor or actress, or figure out which actor or actress will play your character. And then what you can do is you can go to YouTube and watch as many different clips as you can of that actor in interviews, on their TV shows, on their movies, wherever. And the key is to be a student of that person and pay attention to their mannerisms, pay attention to all the things that they do to see if you can impart that into your story. I found that to be a very effective way, because then when you're writing your story, you can have a mental image of that actor in your head. Tip number two is an anti-tip, and this is my personal opinion, but I'm not a big fan of character sketches. I don't think you need to spend all of your time doing character sketches, figuring out what they eat for breakfast and what they eat for lunch, and when they go to the bathroom and all that stuff. I don't think that that's an effective use of your time. I think the most effective use of your time is writing your manuscript. I found that I end up just, whatever I do with the character sketches, I end up throwing away anyway. So it's like, well, I'm not going to waste my time doing that when I could just be writing the novel. So I don't think that it's needed, and something that will save you a lot of time if you just skip this step. Tip number three is to pretend your character is real. So the way you do that is to take inspirations and elements from everyday life and real people and impart those into your character. Because if you treat your character as a real person, then that allows you to do some interesting things and start doing some interesting psychological tactics. Now, if that sounds a little complicated, I've done a full video on that, and I'll link to it in the YouTube card above my head and in the video description, and you can check it out and watch to your heart's content. Tip number four is to do light research before you start writing. So I'm a big proponent of making sure that you only do enough research that you need in order to start your novel. Otherwise, I think that research is one of those things that becomes a trap to a lot of writers, because it's just like this never-ending void. It just sucks you in, and the next thing you know, you're researching your novel for 6 months. I don't recommend that you do that, but I do recommend that you research what you need to know to start writing your novel. I call this foundational research. It's the research that will help you start writing that first page. Now, if you're a pantser and you don't outline your novels, then I highly recommend that you figure out everything that you need to know in order to write that first chapter of your story. Just the first chapter. If you're an outliner, I recommend that you do as much research as you can for the first 25% of your novel. So research everything you need to know for the first 25% of your novel. And we'll talk about what to do for the rest of your novel here in another tip. Some helpful things to learn when you're researching would be the ins and outs of the character's profession, the details about the city where the character grew up, and maybe the characteristics of any illnesses or injuries that the character may be dealing with. I think those are helpful things to know, and if you get those under your belt, it helps you build some early momentum with your story. Tip number five is to research everything else in the moment when you need it. So I talked about foundational research, researching everything you need to get started. Now I'm talking about just-in-time research. These are things that you research when you need them. So for example, you're writing your novel and you come across a scene where your character is in prison or they're in jail, and you've never been in jail before, so you've got to go figure out what's it like to be in jail. You maybe have to do some research and maybe model your jail on a jail that's real, and you have to find YouTube videos and things like that, and you figure all that out. Then you come back to the manuscript and then you start writing and you move on. Just-in-time research, I think, is very helpful because if you think about it, you're not wasting your time in the beginning when you're doing your foundational research. You're researching the things that you actually need. Because I think all of us, have, or at least many of us watching this who've written novels, can attest to the fact that done some research and you ended up not using it. And that's the one thing you want to avoid with research. You only want to research the things that you actually need in your novel. Tip number 6 is another anti-tip. You guys know I love anti-tips. So tip number 6 is to beware of the advice that your character needs a goal for everything. There's a lot of advice floating around there about around the internet about characters needing goals. They need a goal for this. They need a goal for that. They need this type of goal, and they need that type of goal. That's not bad advice, but I think it can become a trap for people because they start focusing on character goals rather than character development. So if you want to learn how to do this properly, I highly recommend you check out the book Goal, Motivation, and Conflict by Deborah Nixon to learn how to do it right. Tip number 7 is a great formula for the first line of the first chapter of your novel if you're struggling to figure out what to write. And that is this: make the first line a description of the problem that the hero is encountering. So make the first line of your first chapter a description of the problem the hero's in. The hero can be describing it, or if it's in the first person, or if it's in the third person, then it can just be a simple description of what's going on with the hero and why they're in such dire straits. And I found that to be it's been very helpful for me because it just makes it very easy to get started. Dean Wesley Smith, a prolific writer and writing teacher, often talks about how the opening of a story is really nothing more than a hero in a setting with a problem. And I think that's a great blueprint and a great way to think about your story, to just be able to sit down and just start writing it right away. Tip number 8 is a general rule of thumb, and that is that you want to introduce your hero as soon as possible, right? So ideally, you want your hero in the first chapter. But that's not always possible with some of you, right? Because you might be doing prologues, or maybe there's some lead up you need to do before you introduce that character. Whatever you decide to do, that's fine. That's up to you. That's the beauty of fiction, right? There's no right or wrong way to do anything, but you want to make sure that you do introduce your hero as soon as possible so that you can start getting your readers invested in them, preferably within the first chapter, or at least the first chapter or two. Tip number 9 is that when you introduce your character, remember that the laws of psychology apply to that character. So for example, if you meet someone for the first time, you're going to form a first impression of that person, right? They're going to leave an impression on you. When your reader meets your character for the first time, your character is also going to leave a first impression on your reader. Have you thought about that? Tip number 10 is that when you introduce the reader to the character, you want to invest the reader into the character. Now that sounds very basic, right? And so the question is, how do you do this? And I think the best way to think about this is to look at the way that the mega bestsellers, the John Grishams, Nora Roberts, James Pattersons of the world, how did they do it? Because if they've sold a lot of books, they're probably doing something right when they open their novels, right? So the advice that we often hear in the writing community is to start your novel in media res, or in media res, I don't know how to pronounce it, which means in the middle of the action, right? I think we've all heard that. But I believe that that's only half true. I think if you look at the novels of the mega bestsellers, pick any of them off the shelf, look at what they're doing, right? And look at the first 3 pages. If you look at them, you're not going to see just tons of action right out of the gate most of the time. What you're going to see is a lot of sensory details. You're going to see that hero in a setting with a problem that I talked about. You're going to see a little bit of backstory about the character to introduce you to them. You're going to get some story on why the character is in the problem that they're in, how they got into the problem that they're in. If there are any supporting characters, there's just going to be a little bit of a back and forth between those characters. And that usually encompasses about the first 500 words of the novel. And it's like clockwork. It's 500 words of the writer investing the reader into the character through the use of sensory details and just understanding of what's going on that got to the hero to the point that they're in. And I think that if you look at any of the mega bestsellers, this will be true. And once you see it, you'll never be able to unsee it. And then you can start learning how to do it in your own fiction. Tip number 11 is that readers experience your story through the eyes of your character. So, how do you get them to really truly dial down into your character's head, right? One of the tips that I've learned is that word choice is really, really important. So don't have your character say things that they would not normally say. So if your character would not normally use the word unscrupulous in a sentence, then don't make them use the word unscrupulous in a sentence, right? Use only words that the character themselves would use. This is especially important in the first person, but it's also important in the third person because you don't want to pull your readers out of the story to think, what does that word mean? Or would that guy ever use that word? Or that's a $1 million word coming from a regular guy there. So make sure that you understand that word choice is really important. Tip number 12 is to hone your people watching skills. So a lot of people ask me what they can do to take their fiction to the next level or what they can do to start learning the craft of fiction. And I always recommend to people to become a good student of people. Learn how people operate. Learn how to take the things that they do in real life and translate that onto the page. And what I think personally is that my way of doing that is going to be completely different from your way of doing that. And you just have to figure out how to do that in a way that works for you. So go to a coffee shop, sit down, pick some random person. Don't be creepy about it, but just look at them and figure out, okay, what's this conversation that these two people are having? Or the guy sitting in the corner sipping coffee from a porcelain mug, what's his story? What's the barista story? And then just figure out how you would write that into a story. And it could be an element here, an element there. The way that you learn how to write good fiction is to take those elements and translate them onto the page. Now, I've done a podcast episode on my podcast, The Writer's Journey. Be sure to subscribe to that. But I did an episode on that on my process of people watching, and I think it's like 5 to 7 minutes long. It's not very long, but I'll drop a link to that in the comments so you can check it out. Tip number 13 is to hone your reading skills. So reading is critically important for any fiction writer's life, but it's also critically important to learn how to do character. So when you come across a character that you love or just a character that you really enjoy and you find yourself thinking, wow, man, how did the writer do that? Here's what you can do. You can study the sections in the book that impacted you, right? Because I think when people think about studying fiction and they think about studying books, they don't know where to start. Just pick 2 or 3 sections where you really found yourself invested in the character, just like you would want your readers to be invested in your character. Pay attention to that. Pick 2 or 3 scenes and then sit down and analyze how the writer did it. So in the example on the screen, I broke down a sex scene that I recently read that I really liked. And when you look at it at the highest level, it leads with a character describing the encounter with one primary sense, touching, for example. So the writer talks about the character's hands on the female character's dress, or her hands on his face, and what the sensations feel like, followed by a coming up for air, then more sensory details, then a coming up for air, and then a climax, which we don't have to describe that, and then a post-sex quiet where the characters are talking, and then a sensual fade to black. So when you look at a scene, break it down into elements, right? So look at each of the different elements in isolation, and then that's how you can start to learn little micro tips on how you can improve your fiction. Tip number 14 is the heart of what I wanted to tell you today, and that is that character development happens in real time on the page when you write. Now, this is Michael Laron's opinion only. That's one of my favorite phrases, but it is my opinion only because I know that some people really, really are big proponents of character sketches and outlining and character arcs and all those things. But I have found that when I'm writing fiction, the character moments that readers love the most in my work are often the moments that I never planned. So when I could sit down and write an outline and write sketches and all these sorts of things and really plan, okay, I want my character to have this moment of development in chapter 3 and then this moment of development in chapter 5. That just feels robotic to me. Instead, what I've learned to do as a fiction writer is, as I'm writing, little opportunities to develop the character present themselves at certain points in the manuscript. The thing I've learned is to learn how to recognize those moments and then dig into them, right? So you may not expect what your character is about to say next, or you may not expect who's about to walk on stage, but you can use that opportunity to develop the character further. And I believe that the best fiction happens that way because it's spontaneous, you're not expecting it, and you're using that skill of being a student of people and being a student of your surroundings and imparting that onto the page. And tip number 15 is related, and that is that character arcs, you don't really need to plan them. They just happen. If you just trust your gut and trust your intuition, you're going to have a character arc. I think that there's nothing more artificial than sitting down and trying to figure out how to get your character emotionally from point A to point B. Again, my opinion only. I think if you just listen to your character and you seize those moments that I talked about in the last tip, all of this stuff will happen for you automatically. Tip number 16 is that character development doesn't happen all at once. You don't just dump every detail of your character on the reader at once in chapter 1, right? It happens gradually over time. It's these little moments that present themselves in each and every chapter, and it's taking the time to do those little moments as they come up. And so if you have a few moments here in chapter 1, a few in chapter 3, a few in chapter 4, and all the way up to the end of the book, right? By the time you get to your final battle, the law of compounding interest, I mean, you'll have at least 1,000 different reasons for readers to be rooting for your character. So if you just remember that all it takes in every chapter is just one little moment or two, every chapter or so, that will go a long way in building your reader's relationship with your character. Tip number 17 is to keep your character's backstory limited to a few sentences or a few short paragraphs at a time, right? So readers, it's hard for them to just sit and read long walls of text about the backstory of a character. The best way I've learned to think about this is to think about writing as building Legos, right? So you've got a bunch of different Legos and you snap them together in order to build what you want to build, right? So your dialogue is a Lego, your action is a Lego, your character's backstory is a Lego, description of setting is a Lego, dialogue, narrative, and action. That's what I call DNA. Each of these things are Legos. And so what you can do is you can have one Lego of dialogue, another Lego of narrative, another Lego of action, another Lego of backstory. And what you do is you just snap these together as you're writing. And so then what that does is it keeps the reader moving down the page, right? So when you come to that Lego where you've got character backstory, keep it to just a few sentences or a short paragraph, and then introduce more of your Legos. And then you come to another section where you snap in more backstory. That helps keep readers moving down the page because it follows the same principle as a pattern interrupt. So if you've ever watched a movie or a television show on mute, you'll notice that the camera angles change every 2 to 3 seconds, right? It's one character looking at each other, and then at another character, and then two seconds later, it's the other character looking at the other character, and then it constantly shifts and cuts, right? And if you think about fiction, that's the same thing. So thinking about each of these elements as Legos will help serve as a pattern interrupt and keep them moving down the page. Tip number 18 is to consider the impact that your point of view has on the reader. So easy way to think about this is in the first person, it's a very conversational point of view. It's very easy for the character to just simply narrate the details of things because it's like they're having a conversation with you, right? But where the hang-up comes is when they start describing what things look like or describing what people look like, right? Because in real life, if I'm having a conversation with you, I don't say, yeah, man, so I walked into the room and the fan was whirring and there were sequins of light pouring in through the window. You don't talk like that to another person, right? And so when you're doing that in the first person, that can sometimes be a little bit of a hang-up, right? But the third person is the exact opposite. It's very easy to describe things and settings and people because the third person is this artificial construct that we as a society have learn to adopt, and we just see right through it. It's as if it doesn't exist. But the hang up in the third person is describing backstory and what happened to a character in their history, because it feels like the writer is doing it when done wrong, rather than it just simply being a viewpoint into that character. So remember that word choice is extremely important with your point of view to help keep the readers pulled into your character's head. Tip number 19 is to have a main character. So it's perfectly fine to have a series with a cast of characters, right? And a cast of main characters that may share the spotlight. Again, like I said, I'm not going to knock anybody. There's no wrong or right way to do it. But do consider, just from benefit of sharing my experience with you, the benefit of having a main character. So even if you have a cast of, say, 2 or 3 main characters, which one is the main one? In other words, which one is the story ultimately about? So let me tell you a story here. So a few years ago, I wrote a space opera series called Galaxy Mavericks. And I really enjoyed this series because it's, in true space opera form, it's a cast of about 7 characters, all sharing the spotlight. And so what I decided to do was have each of the first 7 novels be from the perspective of one of the main characters. And it was kind of their backstory and some of the conflicts that they had. And then in books 8 and 9, it was all the characters coming together, Avenger style, to fight the big bad guy, right? And I love that series, and there's a lot of things about that series that I think I did right from a fiction perspective. But if I had to do it again, I would have rewritten the story so that one of the main characters was the center of that story's universe. Because what ended up happening was readers would read book 1, and that was from the perspective of one character, and then they'd read book 2 from the perspective of another character. But if they didn't like the character in book 2, then that kind of ruined my prospect for the rest of the series, right? So having a main character, I think, would have helped me with that series, and it would have helped the readers stay invested in the story throughout the series. Tip number 20 is that if you do have a story with a cast of main characters, my general rule of thumb is to limit one POV per chapter. So character 1 is in one chapter. Character 2 is in the next chapter. Character 3 is in the next chapter. And you want to alternate this. And I think having one point of view helps keep things clean and consistent for the reader. Now, for a pro tip, as you start to get deeper into the story and you start to get into sections that have faster pacing, something that I like to do is I'll start the chapter with one POV, and then I'll use a section break and then switch to the next POV. And then I'll use another section break and switch to the next POV. That can be kind of fun sometimes because, if things are going really fast and the reader's kind of on the edge of their seats, they don't know what's going to happen next. Sometimes breaking it up with a chapter can be too much, and a section break can help you with that pacing. But one of the things that you want to make sure that you're ensuring is consistency for the reader. Readers like consistency, so keeping one section or one chapter limited to one POV will help you with that. Tip number 21 is to make your POV characters distinct, right? And I think that's a very basic tip, but how do you do that? So I've learned how to do it in a couple of different ways. The first is through word choice. So if you've got 2 completely different characters, having them choose different words to describe things, I think, is a really interesting way to do it. Also, they're going to see things differently as well. So having the reader see different things, I think, would also be important. But one of the ways that I've also learned how to make point of view characters distinct is considering how the page looks visually for each character's chapters. So in my series Moderation Online, for example, I've got a lot of characters in that book, but I have 2 characters in particular. There's one character where it's the main character, and he's just kind of your average hero. He's just an average guy thrown into an average situation, and so his word choice isn't going to be anything crazy. His sentence length and his paragraphs tend to be kind of medium to average. And when you look at his page, it looks like a standard narrative. Like when you look at fiction, you're going to see some dialogue, you're going to see some narrative, you're going to see some action. If you think about the Legos, it's all kind of snapped together in a very traditional way. His characters his chapters are usually paced about medium pacing. They don't usually go very fast. It's just very steady, because he's the main character. On the page, I want readers to look at the pages and see, okay, there's some stability here, right? Now, the other character I wanted to talk about is a character who's a scientist, and he's kind of high strung. He's extremely smart, but he spends a lot of time thinking through problems. And so, if you were to look at one of his chapters, you would see him spending a lot of time in his head, and you would see him talking to himself a lot as he reasons his way through problems, so that you can see how his amazing mind works. So if you were to look at his pages, you might see a little bit thicker paragraphs. You might see a little bit more internal dialogue, and you might see the pacing might be sometimes fast, but sometimes slow. But it might be a little bit on the slower side sometimes, because he's going to be thinking through things. So just consider how you might do that on the page. The key is that once you figure out visually and emotionally how a character's chapters should feel, you want to replicate that every single time in your chapters, because that's what creates consistency, and that's what gets readers, when they turn to one character's chapter that they really like, it gets them excited to read it. Tip number 22 is to keep track of character details as you write. So this is a tip that I've learned to do over the years to help me keep things more consistent. So you guys know that I don't outline anymore. I write all of my books into the dark, or without an outline. And what I've learned to do through this process that's taught by Dean Wesley Smith is I just write my novels, but after every chapter, what I do is I create a separate document in my project. And then that document is an outline as I go. So I outline my stories as I go. And so what I do is I detail the point of view character, the summary of what happened, and then a description of anything that I need to remember moving forward. So for example, if a character is wearing something, I'll be sure to note that. If I introduce a character that's got black eyes, I'll introduce that. If there's a particular part of the setting that I want to remember, I'll do that. And so then later on in the book, when I come back to that, then when I come back to that setting, for example, I can go back to my outline and remember, okay, yeah, I had the trees this color, or that, and so then I can make things consistent. I can also keep track of wardrobe changes throughout the novel as well, because the last thing you want to do is have a character wear a T-shirt, in chapter 1, and then a tuxedo in chapter 10. I'm using silly examples, but you get the point, right? And so doing an outline as I go helps me keep things more consistent. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, but I outlined my novel in the beginning, so why would I need to keep track of my character details? And the answer to that is, even if you take the time to outline your novel, that's not going to help you keep track of character details, because things can change while you're writing your novel. So if you can develop some sort of a system to keep track of your character details as you write, that will help make things more consistent. It takes a little bit more time sometimes, but it will also save you money in editing. Tip number 23 is that your hero gets the villain they deserve, but it's also true that your villain gets the hero they deserve too. Tip number 24 is optional, but it's just something to think about. Have you ever considered doing your book cover before writing your novel? So sometimes this can be a really creative thing to do, because your designer will usually put your main character on the front cover, right? And so it's kind of interesting sometimes to see that main character on the cover and then write your novel with that image as your North Star. Again, I recognize that this is not always doable for everybody, but definitely something that has worked for me in the past, and something to consider. Tip number 25 is that your main character is the cornerstone of your novel, right? Why not make your main character the cornerstone of your marketing? So when you're pitching your book to someone, what can you say about your main character? When you are writing your book description, how can you make your main character the center point of your book description? When you're writing ads for Facebook and Amazon ads, how can you make your main character front and center, the center point of your marketing? Because that's what readers buy a story for, right? They buy a story for a unique premise and a unique character, and when they buy your next book, they're buying your next book because they like your character. Tip number 26 is to enroll in the WMG Workshop online writing courses by Dean Wesley Smith and Christine Catherine Rush. So they're not sponsoring this video, but I've taken many of their courses, and I can tell you that they have completely transformed the way that I think about fiction and the way that I approach not only writing it, but teaching it to you guys. So they're phenomenal courses. I'll drop links to them in the video description, but I've always thought that it's a really good idea to get instruction and learning and wisdom from people who have been there and done that and who have written a lot of novels. I want to let you guys know that this video has been sponsored by my book, How to Write Your First Novel, the stress-free guide to writing a novel for beginners. So I hold your hand and walk you through every single process of coming up with your novel idea all the way to getting it ready for publication. So if you've never written a novel before, this is the perfect next buy for you. But if you have written a novel and just want some more tips and enjoyed the tips in this video and want more of the like, then it'll be a great read for you. And don't forget to watch the rest of the videos in my How to Write Engaging Main Character series for more great character tips. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
Perfect.